This is our Learn Soldering board number 2. This is a running lights board with a start, stop, and speed function. To begin this board, let's start with the resistors. Grab 10 resistors, bend them into shape, and insert them into the board. You can choose to do one at a time or do them all at once. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. Since this is my 10,000th time doing this, I'm going to do them all at once. If you choose to do them all at once, solder the outside pins first. Solder just the outside pins, clip them, and then move to the inner pins. This allows us an easier to work with area and is the best way to do many components at once. Now that we've finished our resistors, we're going to move on to the ICs. Grab your bags labeled 555 timer and 4017. The 555 timers belong in the block labeled timer ICs. Their footprints are noted by a big LM555 silkscreen in the middle. The 4017 chips go in the LED controller IC block. Gently bend the legs of your IC into place and insert them in the board. Be very careful to make sure you insert these chips with the proper orientation. The semicircle on the top of the chip should line up with the semicircle on the silkscreen footprint. Use your fingers to hold the chips in place and lay your board upside down. Tack the ICs into place by soldering the corner of one pin on each IC. Then solder the rest of the pins. When finished with our ICs, use the solder joint identification guide to inspect our solder joints. Make sure there are no shorts or cold joints. Next, grab our bag of LEDs. Remember that LEDs are polar components. The long positive leg must line up with the positive sign on the left-hand side of the footprint. For this board, 2 LEDs light up at the same time. And the LEDs that light up are the opposite sides LEDs. For this reason, I like to make my color patterns with matching lights. The 2 white lights in each corner will light up in the same time, followed by the 2 reds and 2 blues. I highly recommend doing 2 rows of lights at once. This allows us to have space to work with and keeps the board laying flat. Hold the LEDs in with your fingers, flip the board over, and begin soldering. When at first soldering, the board may want to shift a little bit as the LEDs are loose, but once you solder a few in, the board will become more stable. After finishing your first 2 rows of LEDs, clip the legs off and get ready to solder the next 2 rows. Insert your next 2 rows in any color pattern you'd like, put your fingers on the LEDs, flip the board over, and get soldering. When you finish those 2 rows, put your LEDs in your last middle row. Ensure that you're always inserting your LEDs with proper polarity. The long leg gets inserted into the left-hand side of the component footprint. Finish soldering your LEDs and then we'll move on to the next steps. Oh, and don't forget this little guy up here like I almost did. Next, let's grab our switches. We need 2 push buttons and 1 rectangular slide switch. Let's insert our push buttons and our slide switch. Hold the slide switch while flipping the board over. Try to make sure it's as straight as possible when the board is laying down. Solder the slide switch in first so that it doesn't move when soldering the other switches. When you finish soldering the slide switch, solder the other 2 switches, and then we'll move on to the last step for our project. Our switches are done, so let's pull out our capacitors. For this project, we need 2 ceramic capacitors and 1 electrolytic capacitor. The electrolytic capacitor looks like a tin can. One leg is longer than the other. This means the component is polar, and when inserting it into the board, we have to insert the positive long leg into the left-hand side of the component footprint. Insert the capacitor with the long leg on the left side. Push the capacitor down. It might not sit the whole way flush on the board, but that's 100% fine. Bend the legs gently and flip the board over. Solder in your electrolytic capacitor and then clip the legs. Now that we have our electrolytic capacitor in, we can put in our ceramic capacitors. The ceramic capacitors go in C1 and C2, the rectangular footprints located in the capacitor block. Insert your ceramic capacitors. Ceramic capacitors are non-polar. They can go in any orientation and do not have a positive or negative lead. After you insert your capacitors, gently bend the pins and flip your board over. Solder your capacitors and then clip the legs. For our final step, grab the bag labeled miscellaneous. Find your female DC barrel jack and plug it into the board. Solder in your barrel jack. Remember, these have more metal and may take longer to heat up. The pad is also larger, so we should feed more solder to make sure the entire pad and component leg are covered. Our board is finished and it looks beautiful, so let's plug in the battery and see if it works. If your board is not working properly, try checking the solder joints. Make sure there's no shorts or cold joints. And if you can't figure out what's wrong, feel free to reach out to me through the comments. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed your soldering board.